Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Zeke-ollege Football. I'm your host, Zeke Kransdorf. Today, we're going to be talking about the first of the Power Four conferences. I'm used to saying Power Five, but that is not the case now in current college football. We're talking about the Power Four conferences. Now, we've reached that point of the season. We're done with the Group of Five ranks, done with the Pac-2. Today we're talking about the ACC. Now, the ACC is a good football conference. It's not a great football conference. Really, its strength is and always has been basketball. That's what it's mainly known for. We're in the thralls of March Madness, and the ACC is well represented there. But in terms of ACC football, there are a couple national brands and national names, but we'll get into that throughout the show. And there's been a couple headlines recently about the ACC, a couple teams suing the conference to try to get out of their contracts, specifically Florida State, Clemson, trying to get out of the ACC's media contract so they can potentially leave for greener pastures. But in the meantime, it's still a conference, it still exists, and in my quest to talk about all 134 FBS college football teams, we're going to go through the new ACC conference. Now, much like the Big 12 and Big 10, you'll see a couple of former Pac-12 schools joining the ACC now. And then you'll also see the addition of one school from the American Conference as well. But enough dilly-dallying, enough scooting around the point. Let's get started with this preview. So we're going to start off at the top, Boston College. It's going to be year one for Bill O'Brien. That's a very familiar name for people in the New England area. Bill O'Brien last year was the offensive coordinator for the Patriots, former Belichick assistant, NFL coach for the Houston Texans, former offensive coordinator for Alabama. He's been around. This is the first big head coaching opportunity that he's had in the college ranks in a fairly long time, from what I believe. And this is to replace Jeff Hafley, who moved up to the NFL to become a defensive coordinator for the Green Bay Packers. They went 7-6 last year with a win in the Fenway Bowl. The big thing is returning production. Thomas Castellanos is back at quarterback. Kai Robichaux back at running back. And they're bringing in Trayshawn Ward, former Florida State running back. He went over to TCU last year. So it should be a fairly potent offense for Boston College. But the biggest thing that needs to happen is Thomas Castellanos needs to limit those turnovers. He was an effective threat in both the air and the ground, but man, oh man, he was a bit of a turnover machine. 15 passing touchdowns, but 14 interceptions. It just can't happen. That's not a recipe for success. It's not a recipe for winning. So next, we'll sort of introduce a new team to the ACC, one of those schools that came over from the Pac-12. We're talking about the California Golden Bears. It's year 8 for Justin Wilcox. He was on the hot seat, actually, before last season, able to keep his job, a 6-7 year last year with a loss to Texas Tech in a bowl game. It's going to be the first year in the ACC, brand new, a lot more travel than they have had to do in the past. Uh, that's what happens when you're a West Coast team playing in the Atlantic Coast Conference. Geography in college football, that's a whole topic for another show. But um, the good news for Cal is you're able to maintain your young core of players. Francisco Mendoza, he was a great player for them last year. He's back at quarterback. Jaden Ott is back at running back. Uh, and you're adding to your receiving core. Tobias Merriweather coming over from Notre Dame to really round out that receiver room. So a lot of returning production for Cal. So it's going to be interesting to see how they fare against different competition, not higher competition per se, but just different competition. Now let's talk about Clemson. So year 17 for Dabo Swinney. He's been there for a long, long time. 9-4 record last year, which, for most programs, you hear 9-4, you're like, oh, that's a great season. For Clemson, they hold themselves to a higher standard. That's the worst record under Dabo Swinney since 2010. And part of it is just because there is a whole aspect to the current college football game that Dabo Swinney's just not implementing whatsoever. You've heard a lot about it. We're talking about the transfer portal. They had a fair number of players transfer out of the program. I would say an average amount of players transfer out, given that they're a Power 5 program. Or, sorry, Power 4. I need to start correcting myself every time I say that now. One of the biggest losses that they had actually was one of their starting corners, Toriano Pride, who transferred over to play back closer to home over for the Missouri Tigers. Now they will be returning their quarterback. Cade Klubnik's back. Both Will Shipley and Phil Maffa are back at running back. But the fact that you have players transferring out of the program, and as of right now, Dabo Swinney has not committed a single player from the transfer portal to come to Clemson. And it's not like Clemson's a bad spot to go to. It's a good spot to go to. So, what's missing there? It's a pool of talent that is just not being tapped into. And I feel like that might come back to haunt Clemson a little bit. We start to see this sort of regression. Does it spiral? Does it continue to drop? Let's talk about Duke. Duke was a big surprise team last year. They started off the season with a huge upset over Clemson on a Monday night. Their head coach, Mike Elko, leaves for Texas A&M after the season. Their starting quarterback, Riley Leonard, also leaves. He's heading off to Notre Dame. So what's next for the Blue Devils? It's year one for Manny Diaz. Manny Diaz, former Miami head coach. You do return some players. Jordan Moore's back at running back. However, one of your other running backs decided to transfer out, Jordan Waters. We'll touch on him a little bit later. So you're seeing the transfer portal sort of tearing Duke apart a little bit, but they're going to try to rebuild it. Malik Murphy, who filled in for a couple games for the Texas Longhorns last year, he's coming over to be the starting quarterback. From what I've noticed in Malik Murphy's game, he does get rattled by pressure. So they need to make sure that offensive line stays intact and returns as many starters as possible. Now, Manny Diaz is also a defensive coach, so the Duke defense should be in a good spot. But I'm a little bit worried about their offense, seeing that some of the playmakers from last year have left. Uh, Coming up next, we'll talk about Georgia Tech. So Georgia Tech, it's year 2 for Brent Key, 7-6 last year, which is a huge improvement from where they were at as a program before that. The Jeff Collins era was atrocious for the Yellow Jackets, and they they found a new sort of identity, and that's come with Haynes King, former Texas A&M quarterback. He transferred over to Georgia Tech and has made an immediate impact. Jamal Haynes returning at running back, receiver room staying relatively consistent. Now, the toughest thing for Georgia Tech is uh, really consistency. Um, yes, you have some of the same players that you did last year, but that was a very inconsistent team. Uh, there's a sort of running joke going on that Georgia Tech was a bipolar team because uh, it didn't matter what week it was. The results that they had just didn't make any sense. They beat Miami when Mario Cristobal ran the ball, his running back fumbled, and then they scored on a last-second Hail Mary after um, Miami could have just ran out the clock. Very next week, they lose to Bowling Green. Then they come back and upset the Drake May North Carolina team. They're a very up and down team. Um, so getting that consistency out of Georgia Tech, uh, it'll be interesting to see what Brent Key does in his second full year as a head coach. And they have to, get their stuff in order a lot quicker than some of the other teams do. They start off their season in week 0 in the exhibition game over in Dublin against Florida State, and Florida State should be a pretty good team again this year. And actually, talking about Florida State, let's go over there. So it's year 5 for Mike. It's year 5 coming up for Mike Norvell, 13-1 last year, and they are the reigning ACC champions. There was a lot of controversy last year, specifically regarding the 4-team college football playoffs. You saw a 13-0 conference champion essentially eliminated because their starting quarterback for the year, was injured. And that's part of the reason, one of the consequences of having the 14 playoff. We don't have that anymore. It's going to be a 12-team playoff, at least for this year. And that one loss was in a bowl game against Georgia. A lot of players sat out for Florida State. They were clobbered is a bad word to use, but it's an accurate word to use in that sense. It was dominant by Georgia, 63-3 over Florida State. I was watching that game with my family, and it seemed like every single time I turned away from the TV, Georgia was scoring another touchdown. So, a lot of the players felt snubbed by the committee, rightfully so. It caused a huge media stir, lawsuits by the state of Florida, etc. Now, back to the football. For Florida State, a bunch of your key players are leaving for the NFL draft. Jared Verse, Jordan Travis, Keon Coleman, Johnny Wilson. You have a lot of talent that's leaving this team. But they're also pretty active in the transfer portal, bringing in some talent as well. DJ Uyunglele, former Clemson quarterback, former Oregon State quarterback, coming in to play signal caller for the Seminoles. They're also bringing in Marvin Jones Jr. From Georgia as an impact player at linebacker. And then they're revamping the wide receiver room. Lost a couple key contributors. Now Malik Benson from Alabama, Jaylen Brown from LSU, and Jalen Lucas from Indiana coming in to sort of refresh that wide receiver room for Florida State. Now, let's talk about Louisville. Louisville was a big surprise team last year. It was year one for Jeff Brom. Now it's year two. They went 10-4 last year. Did collapse a little bit towards the end of the season. Heading into rivalry weekend, they were actually 10-1. They lost to Kentucky. They lost to Florida State in the ACC championship game. And then they lost their bowl game to USC as well. It's going to look a little different for Louisville. Out goes Jack Plummer, the sixth-year quarterback. In comes Tyler Shuck, a seventh-year quarterback, former Oregon quarterback back in 2020, but also most notably from Texas Tech. Ja'Cory Brooks from Alabama is coming over to replace Jabari Thrash, who left to the NFL draft. And then they'll have a running back tandem of Jawar Jordan and Penny Boone, who is coming over from Toledo. So, it's something to certainly be wary of. It's going to look a little different, but still some good pieces. Now let's talk about Miami. It's year three for Mario Cristobal. They were 7-6 last year. They're a good team. And every single year we say that Miami has the talent to make a run, but the issue has always been coaching. Cristobal is a great recruiter, but can he coach the team to wins? So any preseason prediction on Miami is based on how high you are on Mario Cristobal's coaching ability. So his recruiting ability was never put in question. Another huge recruiting class for the Hurricanes. They have the 4th overall recruiting class in the nation. Great stuff. 5-star players, 4-star players, a bunch of talent coming in. There is a significant upgrade, or at least what I view as a significant upgrade at the quarterback position. Tyler Van Dyke is out. He transfers to Wisconsin. In comes Cam Ward from Washington State. Certainly adds more athleticism, and he's not the most consistent decision maker, but he certainly has the tools to be an NFL caliber quarterback. So it'll be interesting to see how Miami does. Next up, North Carolina. It's year 6 in the second stint of Mack Brown, who's the North Carolina head coach back in the late 90s. 8-5 last year. And that was with an NFL quarterback in a high round pick in Drake May. He's off to the NFL draft. They keep a relatively consistent receiver room. Omarion Hampton's coming back at running back. And for the quarterback position, they're bringing over Max Johnson from Texas A&M. Now, NC State. Year 12 for Dave Doran. They were 9-4 last year, a sneaky 9-4. It was a good NC State team that really was kind of underrated. Their starting quarterback last year, MJ Morris, transfers out. He'll be playing in the Big Ten. Uh, and coming into play, quarterback is someone who I'm very high on, Grayson McCall. The Coastal product, he just a very, very good player in the Sun Belt, was the Sun Belt player of the year last year. He's just a very good quarterback, and I think he could be an NFL type quarterback as well. Jordan Waters from Duke and Dalen Smothers from Oklahoma coming in to fix uh, NC State's running back issue. Uh, they were a very good team in a lot of ways last year. Running the ball was not one of them. Uh, their leading rusher was their quarterback last year, Brennan Armstrong. He's since graduated. Their second leading rusher was a wide receiver on their team. And their actual leading running back on the team had 309 yards on the season. That's not good enough. If you want to make a run towards the ACC title game, that's just not good enough. So they brought in a couple transfers to fix that up. So we'll see how NC State fares coming up next season. Now for Pitt. It's year 10 for Pat Narduzzi. They were a very, very disappointing team last year. 3-9 on the season. Christian Valou, and he'll be battling against Eli Holstein, who came over from Alabama. Not a huge portal haul to replace some of the talent gaps on this team, and they're losing their leading receiver, Bub Means, to the NFL draft. Pitt could really, really struggle next year. Let's move on to SMU. SMU is one of those new teams came over from the American Conference. It's year 3 for Rhett Lashley over there. They were 11-3 last year. They actually won the American Conference last year. It'll be Preston Stone back at quarterback. LJ Johnson's going to fill in for the RB1 role. But the biggest question for SMU is how will they adjust to the jump in competition? ACC is a lot tougher than the American is. And we've seen seemingly top teams in the group of 5 level struggle to make that leap. You look over to the Big 12, Cincinnati, and UCF, some of those top teams in the American Conference really struggled in their first year in the Big 12. So it'll be interesting to see how SMU does in comparison. Now, Stanford. It's year 2 for Troy Taylor. They were 3-9 last year. Ashton Daniels is back at quarterback. Their leading receiver, Alec Aomanor, is back after his 1,000-yard season. In terms of running backs, though, their team's leading running back, E.J. Smith, son of Emmitt Smith, transferred over to Texas A&M. So they should have a solid season, but I wouldn't expect them to make a huge leap in year 1 in the ACC. Now for Syracuse, it's year 1 now for Fran Brown. Dino Babers was fired in the offseason. And they were 6-7 last year, including a blowout loss to South Florida in the Boca Raton Bowl. Now, pair of Georgia receivers, Jackson Meeks and Yazid Haynes, are coming over to replace Damian Alford, who was the leading receiver for Syracuse last year. It makes sense that the players coming over are from Georgia. Fran Brown, former running backs coach for Georgia. Biggest story for Syracuse is at the quarterback position. Last year, they had Garrett Schrader. Schrader graduated. So they brought in one of the most highly touted transfer portal quarterbacks, Kyle McCord, last year's starter over at Ohio State, coming over and playing for the Syracuse Orange. So it'll be interesting to see Kyle McCord really take that step and make just to see whether or not he was what ran that Ohio State offense or whether he was carried by all the talent around him. So it's going to be certainly something to look out for this upcoming season. Now, Virginia. Year 3 for Tony Elliott. They were 3-9 last year. They are returning some players, namely their quarterback, Anthony Calandria. He's back. Malik Washington, the team's leading receivers, heading off to the NFL draft. They're bringing in Chris Tyree from Notre Dame over to play running back. But that doesn't change the fact that Tony Elliott's on the hot seat. They were 3-7 in his first year, 3-9 last year. If there is not improvement and improvement relatively soon, I don't expect him to be the head coach for the Cavaliers in the near future. No. Virginia Tech. Year 3 for Brent Pry, 7-6 last year. And most importantly, Kyron Drones is back at quarterback. He was the team's leading passer and leading rusher last year. Pardon me. He also added a lot on the ground, though. And he was very consistent through the air. 17 passing touchdowns, only 3 interceptions. As a freshman. He's coming back. He's going to be a sophomore now. So Kyron Drone, certainly a player to look out for. Biggest addition in the portal was Aeneas Peebles, the defensive tackle from Duke. But the story for Virginia Tech is they need some new wide receivers to really step up next season. Some of their top threats last year graduated. And then finally, Wake Forest. Year 11 for Dave Clawson, 4-8 last year. Their starting quarterback last year, Mitch Griffiths, transferred out. He'll be playing for Marshall next season. In his stead comes in Hank Bachmeier, who played for Louisiana Tech last year. Pretty disappointing season for Louisiana Tech last year. And, former Boise State quarterback sort of got chased away from that job by Taylon Green. So it's going to be interesting to see how Hank Bachmeier does in his third stop, but he won't have great weapons around him. Jamal Banks, the leading receiver for Wake Forest last year, transferred out. He'll be playing for Nebraska next season. And the wide receiver room for Wake Forest is really looking pretty depleted. So that will conclude the preview section of the episode. And during this little mid-roll, it's a great time to remind you, drop a follow over on Instagram, Zeke.ollege Football. So that is Zeke.OLLEGE over on Instagram to see not only some graphics of the predictions that I made, like standings, but also to see what conference we're talking about next. And then I also make some short form content for YouTube Shorts and Instagram Reels as well. It's also a great time if you're seeing this on the radio or listening to it on the radio. Go over and check out the full recaps for all of my other episodes over on my YouTube channel. That is Zeke-ollege Football over on YouTube. So go ahead and check that out. Again, I'll be posting these episodes as well as some additional episodes, little short form contents, and then other bits and pieces talking about the ins and outs of college football. But let's get into the actual predictions side of things. Starting with Boston College. So in week 1, I see them losing to Florida State before they beat Duquesne at home, lose on the road at Missouri, and lose to Michigan State at home before beating Western Kentucky and beating Virginia on the road before their bye week. I see them losing at Virginia Tech, beating Louisville at home before another bye, losing to Syracuse, beating SMU on the road, losing to North Carolina, and then beating Pitt in the final week of the season, going 5-7 and 3-5 in conference. For the Wake Forest Demon Deacons, I see them going 3-9 with wins against NC Louisiana, and at UConn. I don't see them getting a single conference win. I see them losing to Virginia, losing to Ole Miss, losing to Clemson, losing to California, and losing to Duke at home. I also see them losing to NC State, Stanford, North Carolina, and Miami on the road. For Cal, I see them beating UC Davis, losing to Auburn on the road, beating San Diego State, losing to Florida State on the road before a week 5 bye week. In week 6, I see them losing to Miami, beating Pitt on the road, losing to NC State and Oregon State for a bye week. I see them beating Wake Forest on the road, losing to Syracuse, beating Stanford in the game. That's what they call it. They call it the game. And then beating SMU, going 6-6 and 4-4 in conference. For Virginia Tech, I see a big year for Virginia Tech, and that's partially because I see a very advantageous schedule. I see them beating Vanderbilt on the road, beating Marshall, beating Old Dominion on the road, beating Rutgers, and beating Miami on the road. I do see them losing at Stanford. You can chalk that up to the first big trip out west. A lot more travel, quicker turnaround times, etc. I see them beating Boston College, beating Georgia Tech, and beating Syracuse after their bye week before they drop a game to Clemson. And then I see them finishing off the season at Duke with a win and beating Virginia in the final week of the season. Speaking of Virginia, let's talk about the Cavaliers. I see them going so actually, let me double back for a second. Virginia Tech going 10-2, 6-2 in conference. Now for Virginia, I see them beating Richmond, beating Wake Forest on the road, losing to Maryland, and beating Coastal Carolina on the road before their bye, losing to Boston College, beating Louisville, losing to Clemson and North Carolina before a bye week, beating Pitt on the road, losing to Notre Dame on the road, beating SMU, and losing to Virginia Tech, going 6-6, 4-4 in conference. Now for Clemson. I see Clemson having a pretty good season here. Um, First things first, they start off the season a little bit tough. Tough game here. Neutral siter against Georgia. I see them losing that one. I see them beating Appalachian State before a bye week in week 3. Beating NC State, beating Stanford, losing to Florida State on the road. I see them winning out the rest of their schedule. So beating Wake Forest, Virginia, Louisville, Virginia Tech on the road, Pitt on the road, the Citadel, and South Carolina, finishing 10-2, 7-1 in conference. Pardon me. Now, for the Duke Blue Devils, I see them beating Elon, losing to Northwestern on the road, beating UConn, beating Middle Tennessee on the road, before losing to North Carolina, Georgia Tech, and Florida State. I see them beating SMU, losing at Miami and at NC State before another bye week, and then I see them losing to Virginia Tech and beating Wake Forest, going 5-7, 2-6 in conference. For the Syracuse Orange, I see them beating Ohio, beating Georgia Tech, beating Stanford, beating Holy Cross, beating UNLV on the road, before they lose at NC State before their second bye week. And after that bye week, I see them beating Pitt on the road, losing to Virginia Tech at home, beating Boston College, beating Cal, and beating UConn, all 3 of those games on the road. And then I see them losing to Miami in the final game of the season, going 9-3, and with that being 5-3 in conference. For Stanford, in year 1 of the ACC, I see them losing to TCU. I see them beating Cal Poly before their bye week, losing to Syracuse, losing to Clemson on the road, both the Syracuse and Clemson games on the road, beating Virginia Tech, losing on the road at Notre Dame, before losing to SMU. I see them beating Wake Forest, losing at NC State before their second bye week, and I see them losing to Louisville, losing to Cal in the big game, before beating San Jose State in the final week of the season, going 4-8, 2-6 in conference. For SMU, first week 0 game that we've covered so far in the ACC. At Nevada, I see them winning that one, beating Houston Christian, beating BYU before a bye week. I see them losing to TCU, losing to Florida State, losing at Louisville before a second bye week. I see them beating Stanford on the road, losing to Duke, losing to Pitt before their third bye week, because in week 0 they have 3 bye weeks, and then losing to Boston College, losing at Virginia, and losing to Cal to finish the season 4-8, going 1-7 in conference. Now for Pitt, I see them beating Kent State, losing at Cincinnati, losing to West Virginia, beating Youngstown State before a bye week, losing at North Carolina, losing to Cal, losing to Syracuse, beating SMU on the road, losing to Virginia, losing to Clemson, losing to Louisville on the road, and losing to Boston College on the road, going 3-9, 1-7 in conference. For North Carolina, I see a hot start to the season. They host 4 straight home games to start off the season, beating Minnesota, beating Charlotte, beating NC Central, and beating James Madison. Uh, Before they travel on the road at Duke, which I think they win that one. I think they beat Pitt at home as well before losing to Georgia Tech. Uh, and then after their first bye week, I think they beat Virginia on the road, lose to Florida State on the road for a second bye week, finish off the season, beating Wake Forest, beating Boston College on the road, but dropping that game to NC State to finish off the year 9-3, 5-3 in conference. Speaking of NC State, beating West Carolina, losing to Tennessee at a neutral site in week 2. I see them beating Louisiana Tech before losing to Clemson in week 4. And then I see them winning the rest of their games, beating Northern Illinois, beating Wake Forest, beating Syracuse at home, beating Cal on the road, beating Stanford at home, beating Duke at home, beating Georgia Tech on the road, and finally beating North Carolina in Chapel Hill. So I see them going 10-2, 7-1 in conference. Let's talk about Miami next. First game at Florida. I think they lose that game in the Swamp. Before beating Florida A&M, beating Ball State, beating USF on the road. I see them losing to Virginia Tech at home before beating Cal on the road, beating Louisville on the road, losing to Florida State, but beating Duke, beating Georgia Tech, beating Wake Forest, and beating Syracuse on the road, going 9-3, 6-2 in conference play. For the Louisville Cardinals, I see them beating Austin Peay, beating Jacksonville State, beating Georgia Tech, before losing to Notre Dame on the road, beating SMU, losing to Virginia on the road, losing to Miami, beating Boston College, losing to Clemson, beating Stanford, beating Pitt, and losing to Kentucky, going 7-5, 5-3 in conference. Now, for Georgia Tech, in Dublin, I think they lose to Florida State. I think they beat Georgia State, lose at Syracuse, beat Virginia Military Institute. So they'll beat VMI in week number 3 before they lose at Louisville, and then they'll have a bye week. I think they beat Duke. I think they beat North Carolina on the road, lose to Notre Dame. I think they beat Virginia Tech before they have a bye week, a loss to Miami, another bye week, a loss to NC State, and a loss to Georgia to finish off the season 5-7, 3-5 in conference. And then finally, Florida State. I see them beating Georgia Tech, beating Boston College, beating Memphis, beating California, beating SMU on the road, beating Clemson, beating Duke on the road, beating Miami on the road, beating North Carolina, beating Notre Dame on the road, beating Charleston Southern, and beating Florida, going 12-0, 8-0 in conference. So I see Florida State being in the title game, most likely against Clemson, based on conference records, as Clemson would have the tiebreaker over NC State in this scenario. But either way, that is my predictions for the ACC. If you agree, go ahead and drop a comment on YouTube or on the Instagram page. If you disagree, feel free to DM me over at Zeke-ollege Football, Zeke.ollege football. And then if you feel so inclined, go ahead and watch the video when it comes out and give it a good old thumbs up and drop a comment if you feel so inclined. And if you don't feel so inclined, don't worry. I won't hold it against you, but it does help with the algorithm and everything like that. So, with that being said, I don't have anything else for this episode. Hopefully, you enjoyed. Stay tuned on the Instagram page to see what I will be covering next. And I might actually put out a special episode, not a preview or predictions episode, but a special interest episode out tomorrow at some time. I'll be hopefully recording that one with a friend of mine. We'll be talking about, well, I'll leave that up to mystery. So, either way, thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you so much for watching and listening. And I will see all of you in the next episode.